For 155 years, no hurricane has made a direct landfall on Hawaii's Big Island. On Saturday, that record held. The eye of Hurricane Lala passed the southern tip of the island and never came ashore. By Sunday morning, more than 126,000 customers across Hawaii were without power. 2 homes had been swept away by floodwater. The island's water department had told every customer to use water for drinking, cooking, and hygiene only. The storm missed. None of that mattered. This is the story of a near miss that behaved exactly like a hit, and of the 2 systems, power and water, that failed together on an island where you cannot drive to the next state for help. But start with the detail that tells you how seriously local officials were taking this before it arrived. Ahead of the storm, ranchers on the Big Island were told to leave their cattle outside, not to shelter them, to leave them standing in open pasture, because the buildings were judged more likely to kill them than the hurricane was. When emergency guidance says the barn is the dangerous place, you are no longer talking about weather. You are talking about whether the structures on that island can take an 80-mile-an-hour gust. Friday, the 14th of August. Lala is still a tropical storm in the central Pacific, tracking west toward the islands. Hawaii's governor declares a state of emergency. Shelters open. Events are canceled across the Big Island. Saturday morning, around 9 o'clock local time, the National Hurricane Center upgrades Lala. Maximum sustained winds have reached 75 miles an hour. It is now a Category 1 hurricane, and its forecast track runs very close to the southern tip of the Big Island. At that point, the island is looking at something it has no modern experience of. A University of Hawaii atmospheric scientist, working from historical newspaper accounts, dates the last direct hurricane strike on the Big Island to 1871, a Category 3 that came ashore on the northeast corner. Everything since has been weaker. Tropical Storm Iselle in 2014 did millions of dollars of damage and cut power to around 17,000 customers. Tropical Storm Darby crossed the southern end of the island in 2016 as a minimal system. Neither was a hurricane at landfall. By Saturday afternoon, more than 200 flights across Hawaii have been canceled. At 5 in the afternoon, Lala is a Category 1 hurricane 30 miles southwest of South Point, with sustained winds of 80 miles an hour. Residents are told to shelter through the night and not to travel. And then the track shifts. The eye passes the southern tip and stays offshore. Forecasters confirm landfall is no longer expected. The 155-year record survives by a margin of a few miles. A meteorologist with the National Weather Service in Honolulu put it in 7 words while the storm was still approaching. It doesn't take landfall to create destruction. Here is why. Landfall describes one point, where the center of the circulation crosses the coast. It says almost nothing about the size of the storm. Lala's tropical storm force winds extended more than 200 miles out from its center. The Big Island is about 90 miles across. The island was inside the storm regardless of where the eye went. And the Big Island has a second problem, that flat coastlines do not. Its terrain goes almost 14,000 feet up. Wind speeds over the mountains and on the exposed slopes can run around 30% higher than the figures quoted in the advisories, and at some elevations, higher still. The reported gusts followed exactly that pattern, widely over 50 miles an hour, more than 70 at South Point, 80 in Kohala, on the northern end of the island. The same terrain does it to rainfall. Warm, saturated air is forced up the volcanic slopes, cools, and dumps. Hawaii County reported accumulations of 5 to 15 inches on windward ground, and more than 20 inches in isolated spots. On steep volcanic terrain, that is not a rainfall statistic. That is landslides, flash flooding, and rivers that stop behaving like rivers. 2 homes were swept away. Watch the power figures move, because the sequence tells you more than any single number. Early Saturday, Roughly 44,000 customers across the state were out. By the middle of Saturday afternoon, the tracker showed just under 43,000, with nearly 32,000 of those on the Big Island alone. By Saturday evening, the county mayor put the figure at around 62,000 and warned that restoration would take days, not hours. By early Sunday, more than 126,000 customers across Hawaii were without power, the majority of them still on the Big Island. The cause was mostly not exotic, trees and debris driven into the lines. But two failures went deeper than that. On the Hamakua coast, on the northeastern side of the island, crews had to begin assessing a 42-mile span of transmission lines after falling trees brought down multiple poles and structures. That is not a repair. That is a survey of a corridor longer than most people's commute in a storm. And 4 independent power producers disconnected from the grid on Hawaii Island because of storm damage. With that generation gone, the utility warned it might have to shed load, deliberately cutting power to some customers to keep the rest of the system standing. Then comes the part that people outside a storm zone never picture. The repair effort itself had to stop. Restoration work was halted whenever conditions became too dangerous for crews. On the Big Island, civil defense asked utility teams to stay off the roads entirely because of flooding and downed trees. Customers on Hawaii Island and in Maui County were told they would be without power at least overnight, with damage assessments only possible once the weather allowed. A grid does not just fail during a hurricane. It stays failed, because fixing it is also impossible during a hurricane. Here is the consequence almost nobody covers, and it is the reason this near miss matters. Hawaii County's Department of Water Supply issued an essential needs-only notice to every water customer on the island: drinking, cooking, and hygiene, and nothing else. The trigger was not damage to the water system. It was the power outages. On a volcanic island, water does not arrive by gravity from a distant reservoir. It is pumped, often lifted hundreds of feet out of deep wells, drilled into the rock, then pushed uphill to storage tanks that serve the communities above. Those pumps run on electricity. When the grid goes down, the pumps stop. What is left in the tanks is what the island has, and it drains at the rate people use it. That is why the notice went out across the whole island rather than to the flooded districts. It was not a response to a shortage. It was an attempt to slow one down before it started. Power and water on the Big Island are not two separate utilities. They are one system with two names, and Lala took both without ever touching the coast. Lala is now moving away. After its closest approach, it turned west and weakened back to a tropical storm, tracking south of the rest of the chain, which is why Maui County, Oahu, and Kauai spent Sunday under tropical storm warnings rather than a hurricane warning. Damaging winds approaching 80 miles an hour were still possible on those islands, with stronger gusts at higher elevations, and the entire state remained under a flood watch. Flooding and landslides on steep ground are the risk that outlasts the wind. On the Big Island, the recovery clock starts now. Crews can only assess what broke once the weather lets them, and the county mayor has already said the outages will likely run for days. So the record stands. In 155 years, no hurricane has made landfall on the Big Island, and Lala did not either. An island of 200,000 people lost most of its power, went to emergency water rationing, watched 2 homes wash away, and took more than 20 inches of rain in places, from a storm that technically never arrived. That is the number worth remembering, not the category, not the landfall, the margin.